Alright, what's going on guys? In this video, I'm going to show you how to upgrade the raw Color of Storms Planeswalker deck. As always, do keep in mind these are not intended to be tier 1 competitive decks. If you want that, consider checking out the latest tournament results, although those decks are very expensive. What we'll be doing is upgrading this deck card by card, sticking to this deck's themes, and doing it on a budget, as we will not exceed this deck's original price with our upgrades. So the raw Color of Storms Planeswalker deck is an is it or blue and red spells matters deck. The idea is to play a bunch of creatures that care about spells, you know, things like Goblin Electromancer and Wee Dragonauts for example, and then, well, you cast spells. Electromancer makes them cheaper, Dragonauts gets bigger, and then you cast lots and lots of spells. The unique cards that come with the deck, the cards you can only get by purchasing it, are Rawl himself, along with Rawl's Dispersal, Precision Bolt, and Rawl's Staticaster. All of these are pretty so-so, although you have to appreciate the art of the Staticaster, am I right? I'm kind of a fan of it. Anyway, as is often the case, the deck is filled with lots of suboptimal cards. Things like Fearless Halberdier and Command the Storm are pretty bad, so we're going to take these out and we're going to replace them with better stuff. Although, the deck does have a larger problem. This is a screenshot of the deck list from the official Magic the Gathering website, and does anyone see a problem here? This is a Spells Matters deck, and there's only 12 spells in the entire deck. That's kind of a problem. We're gonna have to completely overhaul how this thing works, but fortunately, we can still do that on the budget, so no worries there. Okay, first off, we're going to take out the 3 Fearless Halberdiers and replace them with 3 Enigma Drakes. The Halberdiers are terrible, and the Drake is going to give us so much more power in pretty much every single game that we play. It has flying first of all, and it has power equal to the number of instants and sorceries in our graveyard. So while it could have 2 or 3 power in the early game, it could also have, I don't know, 5, 7, 10 power. Basically, this thing gets big, and it also has flying, so it can obliterate our opponent's life total in pretty hefty chunks. Much better than the Halberdier, for sure. Next, we'll take out 1 Rebel Belt Boar and replace it with a 4th copy of Enigma Drake. The Boar is a 4 mana 3/3, which isn't great, and while it gives a creature +2/+0 when it enters the battlefield, it's very unlikely to have the same impact as the Enigma Drake, so this will give us a much better chance of winning. Next, we're going to take out a Muse Drake and replace it with a Crackling Drake. The Muse Drake is a 4 mana 1/3 with flying that draws a card when it enters the battlefield, and the Crackling Drake is like Enigma Drake. It has power equal to the number of spells we've cast, but it also counts cards in exile in case our opponent tries to remove our graveyard, and it also draws a card when it enters the battlefield. So they both cost 4 mana, they both have flying, they both draw a card when they enter the battlefield, but the Crackling Drake is always going to have more power. Next, we're going to take out 2 Hellkite Whelps and replace them with 2 more Crackling Drakes. The Hellkite Whelps are not that great. They're 5 mana 3/3s with flying that can ping a creature when they attack. Not that great. You know, the card's not legal and standard anymore, but I can't help comparing it to Glorybringer, and yeah, it's a pretty bad comparison. Anyway, the Crackling Drake is pretty sweet, and once again, yes, it will win games. Next, we're going to take out 1 Passwall Adept and 1 Vidalcan Mesmerist and replace them with 2 more Goblin Electromancers. The Passwall Adept can make a creature unblockable, but most of our stuff is going to have flying in this build, so it's not really that useful. And the Mesmerist gives a creature -2/-0 when it attacks, but I don't know, it's not that exciting. The Electromancers are going to make most of the stuff in our deck cheaper, which is going to allow us to play more spells at a quicker pace, which in turn is going to make the Drakes get bigger faster. So Electromancers are just going to make this whole deck smoother and more efficient. So let's go with those. Next, we're going to take out all 4 Precision Bolts, and we're going to replace them with 4 Lightning Strikes. Do I even need to justify this? I mean, let's see. They both deal 3 damage to any target, but the Lightning Strike costs 1 less mana and can do it at instant speed. So it's just better. There's no comparison. 1 less mana, does the same thing at any time. Next up, we're going to take out to Command the Storm and replace them with 2 Beacon Bolts. So Command the Storm is basically a creature removal spell. Since it can only target creatures, it's basically a 5 mana spell to remove a creature, and it has to have 5 toughness or less. So Beacon Bolt costs 2 less mana, and it deals damage equal to the number of spells we have in our graveyard and in exile. So it can deal more damage and for less mana. And more importantly, it has Jumpstart, which means we can cast it a second time if we have an extra land to discard. It's a great ability, and I promise you'll come to appreciate it the very first time you're in top deck mode and you hit that land, and then you look to your graveyard and realize that you can cast any card with Jumpstart. Next, we're going to take out 2 Fire Urchins for 2 shocks. We need to convert some of these creatures into spells, and this one is pretty so-so. It's a 2 mana creature that gets +1/+0 when we cast spells, but the problem is, in order to get really good value out of it, we need to cast like 3 or 4 spells in a single turn, you know, just to make it really worth it. So most of the time this isn't going to be very impressive, so we're just going to replace it with Shock, which lets us kill a creature and possibly kill our opponent if they're low enough on life, and also just dump another spell in the graveyard to pump up our drakes. So I think this is a much better choice. Next, we're going to take out Maximize Altitude and replace it with another Shock. The problem with Maximize Altitude is most of our stuff already has flying, so we really just can't take advantage of it anymore. Shock's going to be way more useful 99% of the time, so we'll go with that. Next, we're going to take out 3 Rawls Staticasters and replace them with 3 Opt. I know this doesn't seem that exciting, but we need more spells for this deck to work, so this is the type of change we do need to make. The Staticasters are weird anyway. They pump themselves up based on the number of cards we have in hand. We're not really looking to hold stuff in our hand for a long time, so we can't really take advantage of that. This would be okay if we were playing a blue control deck that's looking to keep a handful of cards the whole game, but in this deck, I don't know, the Staticasters just aren't that impressive. And Up, on the other hand, is super useful. I know it doesn't seem that impressive. 1 mana to scry and draw a card is kinda boring, but trust me, it's really good. Super useful, definitely worth a change. Next, we're going to take out Erratic Cyclops for another Chemist's Insight. Again, this doesn't seem that exciting because the Insight just draws a couple cards, but it's super useful. Not only does it allow us to draw cards, but with Jumpstart, we can cast it twice, drawing 4 cards in total, and you know, it turns those late game dead lands into gas. We draw that land on turn like 8 or 9, and we don't need it, and suddenly we can just pitch it to the graveyard and draw 2 cards. Super useful. The Cyclops, on the other hand, is just kind of weird. It gets +X+0 when we cast a spell, where X is the converted mana cost. I don't know, it'd be difficult to get this bigger than like a 4/8 at best. I just don't think we can really make it all that big. It seems exciting in theory, but in practice, I don't think it's actually going to get that big very often. So let's just draw into more cards and make those drakes more powerful, because that's what we're going to kill our opponent with, for sure. Next, we're going to take out Leapfrog and Omnispell Adept and replace them with 2 Essence Scatter. Essence Scatter is great. It's always nice to just counter your opponent's biggest threat. Super useful. Leapfrogs and Omnispells, on the other hand, are pretty meh. I mean, don't get me wrong, Leapfrog is super adorable, but the card itself isn't that powerful, and the Adept, on the other hand, well, we just don't really have much use for it. It lets us cast a card from our hand for free, so long as we pay 3 mana and tap it, but we don't really have any expensive spells to start with, so it just, there actually isn't that much use for it, really. I mean, at best, we're going to pay 3 and tap it to play a 4 mana spell, and with the Electromancers, it seems cool, but realistically, there's really not that much use for it. It just doesn't really do anything in this deck. However, I will say that you could probably build a terrible, janky deck with Erratic Cyclops and Omnispell Adept. You could combine these 2 cards with Apex of Power, so you cast Apex of Power for 3 mana, and the Cyclops gets +10/+0. Then the Apex gives you 10 mana and lets you cast things from the top of your library. So the Cyclops is going to get larger with each spell that you cast. It's pretty janky and pretty terrible. No one is ever going to let you keep the Adept and the Cyclops in play, and most of the time you're going to get stuck with Apex of Power in your hand without being able to cast it. So I do not recommend it. But hey, If you want to play a ridiculous deck that's janky and horrible, I guess you could start here. Just don't blame me when you lose all the time because, wow, it's bad. It's awesome, but it's bad. Really bad. Anyway, back to this deck. We're going to take out 2 lands and replace them with 2 lava coils. These decks always have too many lands, so we can afford to take a couple out for another spell to deal with creatures. 2 mana to deal 4 damage to a creature isn't bad, so I think this is perfectly fine for this deck. And that's it. Those are all of our upgrades. If you want to dump a little bit more money into this thing, the things you want to consider are things like Niv Mizzet, Ionize, and Search for Azganta. Niv Mizzet isn't technically too expensive, but we need a lot of dual lands in our mana base to reliably cast it, and those are expensive. Anyway, Ionize is a pretty great counterspell that shocks our opponent when we cast it, and Search for Azganta lets us filter our draws every single turn. It also flips into a land that lets us start drawing cards, so it's really good for the late game as well. Also, if you want to upgrade the mana base, you want to consider things like Sulfur Falls and Steam Vents. Unfortunately, these are very expensive, but they will make your mana a lot better and you'll get color screwed a lot less often. Going forward with the deck, if you do want to include the more expensive cards, I would suggest taking out things like Direct Current, Sonic Assault, and Rawl's Dispersal, in addition to Rawl himself. You know, they're fine, but definitely things like Niv Mizzet and Ionize would be much better, so these are fine for now. I think we can get away with them, but you know, if you have an Ionize, feel free to take out that Sonic Assault or Direct Current, totally fine. Anyway, that's the deck. Our total upgrade cost is
$4.83,
which isn't much, and while the resulting deck won't be winning you a Grand Prix, if you're playing this thing straight out of the box, then this should be significantly more powerful than what you're playing now. We have a whole lot more power, and we paid very little for it, so that's always nice. Right. Anyway, if you want to see more Planeswalker deck upgrade videos, check the description, there should be a playlist, and consider checking out the channel if you like budget Magic the Gathering. It's kind of what I do, but in the meantime, thanks for watching, I hope this video was helpful, and I will see you in the next one.